digitisation is a really key, a really material component to the cultural offer that exists in the UK today. And William will be delighted to see that I have also pointed out that I'm not talking about Born Digital here. So digitisation is not Born Digital, though what it is creation of images and data from analogue or material cultural content. Though, as William says, obviously once it has been created into images and data, it then does need digital preservation. So, as William pointed out earlier, there is a link. So that's what I'm talking about. And what was really the thrust behind the project was the potential of digitisation. So we've heard, I've been to some fantastic sessions both this morning and earlier this afternoon, really kind of showcasing the means that digitisation is the means by which cultural content can be made newly accessible. We've talked and seen about how it can break out of the need to visit the physical location of content. So I just went to a great session by Kathleen who was talking about not only making the material accessible, but using remote volunteering to digitise material because it was online. So it's not just about making the content available, it's actually drawing in people to participate and exchange in its use. It's also available for new audiences and new uses. Again, a fantastic example for those of you who were at the Brighton session with Kevin Bacon. Some lovely examples there about new audiences and new uses. And digitisation makes data available for future generations and provides contextual information that improves data discovery and linking. So all really positive stuff there. So what's the problem with digitisation? The problem is that it's expensive, and as many of you will know, there have been a lot of cuts. So people struggle to find funding to do this digitisation. How do you link your digitised collection to other people's digitised collections? How do people know where they are? How do they know what's been digitised? So there are lots of real issues. IP is another one. So some real challenges. So huge potential, but some real challenges that needed addressing. So as part of the Cultures Digital project, there were a series of policy commitments that came out of that. And one of them, they were in three sections. In the future strategy section, called Unleashing the Creative Potential of Technology. There is Policy Commitment 10, excitingly named Policy Commitment 10. And that was that the National Archives, where, as William said, I work, was going to create a task force to take this new strategic approach to digitisation and see what we could do to recommend seeing if we could solve or at least address some of the challenges that I've just outlined. So the vision of the task force was to look at three things. What was digitisation for? And that came out very early as something that was really important. What impact can we as the task force make? And what changes did we want to bring about? If we were going to have a strategic look at digitisation, what did we want to achieve with that? So a group of us got together, so there have been representatives from a lot of the major cultural institutions, many of whom are represented here. So National Archives, obviously, the British Library, the BBC, Culture 24, who've already been mentioned today, the Wellcome Trust, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Tate. I won't list them all. I'll probably forget somebody, so I won't even attempt to list them all. But there are a series of institutions came together, and we've held a couple of workshops so far to really sort of thrash out what are the real major themes that we need to address under this banner. And four themes came up, as you can see: content, data interoperability, economic models, and sustainability. And I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking a little bit through those. Interestingly enough, before I get onto the data interoperability, for those of you with keen eyesight, you'll have noticed that the policy commitment stressed quite a lot about standards, but it became clear quite early on that people felt that standards were quite limiting and quite restrictive, and it was more about data interoperability. So we swapped standards for data interoperability, and I can talk more about that if anyone's interested in talking about that. So to the themes. First, the content. So what we really wanted to do was increase the visibility of digitised content. So it's It's actually really, it's very difficult to link data that's been digitised with other people's data. We thought shared knowledge and better coordination and improved user access and transparency were really important. Understanding the reasons for digitising is also extremely important. William talked earlier about it, digital preservation not being born digital, but there are clearly circumstances in which digitisation is undertaken for preservation needs. If you've got very, very fragile newspapers, for example, there could be audience demand, but there are also other criteria, for example, research projects, all of which create their own context around them, their own reasons, their own rationale, their own fields that are created during the digitisation process. All of those kind of are very important and very relevant. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that came out quite early was that digitisation doesn't always create open content. So there have been a lot of kind of grandiose claims for digitisation. It's been called the democratisation of access, for example. But it doesn't. It's not a catch-all, it's not a silver bullet. For example, National Archives was involved in a project which digitised some very ancient Henry III fine rolls, and they were in medieval Latin and they were in medieval handwriting. So yes, of course you can digitise them, but can people read them? And even if they can read them, can they understand medieval Latin? Yes, there is obviously a community that can say yes to both those questions, but there are an awful lot of people who say no to those questions. So it isn't as simple a process as simply get that material up there and it will open it up to everybody. It's a much more complex process to really make the material accessible and inclusive in a genuine way. And one of the final challenges that we really became aware of around the digitisation landscape as it now stands is that we don't know what's out there. So it's really interesting there was no portal. A colleague of mine was writing an article on Dickens and thought, oh, household words, that's one of the journals that Dickens used to write in. It must be digitised. Couldn't find it. It became a bit of a bugbear, and he thought, right, well, I'm not going to give in. I'm going to carry on until I find this thing. And after several days, he did actually manage to track down digitised copies of household words in a university in America. But it was only that doggedness that enabled him to find it, and that's the problem with some of the material. Each individual institution has digitised content. It sits on their own website. So if people go to that website, it's often very easy to find. But how do they know to go to that website in the first place? So there are real issues with knowing it's there and then linking it up. And that's one of the real challenges that we face just to get a level playing field from the start. There's also the content for the future. So we're really aware that there are kind of quite large gaps in digitisation, and some of that has arisen from the kind of bumps that occur in funding. For example, obviously Wellcome, a very generous funder, but they only fund material that's related to health, medical sciences and well-being. So there's a massive amount of material digitised around those particular subject areas. So you get real kind of lumps, if you like, of material. And if you see the digitisation landscape as, say, a night sky, you've got little clusters of very bright stars around that kind of area where there have been little clusters of digitisation, but the rest of the sky is dark, and that's very much the landscape of British digitisation as it currently stands, and we need to be aware of that. So do we need to think about how to fill those gaps? Again, Simon mentioned this morning about the consequences of digitising the collections we currently have and kind of recreating those kind of values, the cultural values of the kind of British imperial collections of the 19th century. And that's something we do really need to be seriously aware of. And I thought that was a point very well made. We also need to ask, particularly again in that particular context, what's digitisation for? So it may be for commercial gain, but it may also be in relation to the point I've just made that we need to make sure that there are contents and collections that are being digitised that do represent everyone in the community, that are inclusive, and that mean that our collections policy in terms of digitisation is ethical and inclusive. You also need to be aware that digitisation, again, is not a silver bullet either in the way it represents material. So particularly this is a museums conference, and as many of you will know, okay, 3D digitisation is out there, but obviously you do still lose some sense of the materiality. Can you capture the smell of something in digitisation? No, that bit of it's lost. So again, we need to be aware of what we're gaining, but also what we're losing in digitisation. So really fully awareness of what digitisation is and what it means for our collections. And IP and copyright remain major issues, particularly for newer collections. So to sum up, the content selection is really varied and very patchy. And one of the things we were wondering is, do we need a national strategy for digitisation of collections? Norway has a national strategy for digitising collections, which I think is a great idea. And someone again mentioned earlier the Digital Repository of Ireland. So is that something that that the UK should be doing? Interesting thought. So the second theme was, as I said, we kind of slightly parked the idea of standards and went for data interoperability and skills, again, both things that have been mentioned earlier today. So what we found is when we've been talking to people is that people felt that the standards like IIIF were already really accepted. They're well used, they're widely accepted, and there was no point in the task force reinventing the wheel and trying to create a new set of standards that it would be fairly much impossible to get everyone to agree for, where there were already well recognised international standards. So the data interoperability theme has very much moved into trying to maintain awareness, trying to disseminate information and knowledge about the systems and frameworks which already exist, and promoting flexible standards. So we thought it might be more a question of having a kind of set of principles which people should sign up to, rather than being constrained by a set of very rigid standards which would almost certainly go out of date as soon as they were published and agreed. The other thing that became apparent, and that a couple of members of the task force really wanted to stress, that it was that we really needed to recognise that that there is constant change. So again, that's been referred to this morning about new technologies. I mean, who would have thought 10 or 12 years ago that Twitter didn't even exist? Someone talked about, I think it was Simon talking about the NASA spacecraft. How could they have known that people would want to view these kind of data on YouTube, for example? So we know there's always going to be innovation. We know there will be new technologies, and therefore there will be disruption. So one of the things we really wanted to stress with the data interoperability and the frameworks is that they need to be flexible. They need to be robust enough to be able to open to innovative new technologies, rather than be this very inflexible standards which will quickly break if they don't adapt to novel technologies. We also wanted to recognise the long-term value of metadata, and that's again something that other people have stressed today, and how it's not just the images, it's actually the data that goes with it that makes the content usable and valuable. And again, just to nod to the digital preservation content of the day, we do need to be aware that though digitisation and digital preservation are not the same, once you have digitised contents and assets, you do need to bring in some measure of digital preservation to make sure that the material remains usable, and that the material, the longevity of it is increased. Skills and capability have been something, again, that have come up several times today, which I've been delighted to see. And one of the things, again, that has come out in the discussions that we've had so far is around the emphasis on skills that are central to the development of expertise within cultural organisations. And again, we've been sort of poking around, pushing a light around, how that needs to happen. Obviously, it needs to work for cultural organisations of all sizes. It's no good just having the big National British Museum, fantastic as we've seen today. But for the one-person museum, they also need to be able to run digital preservation systems to access digitisation capability. So how are we going to do that? Is that a question of knowledge centres? Is it a question of providing training? Do we need some career development schemes or exchanges, perhaps some professional mentoring? Or do we have a kind of hub and spoke model where some of the centres of expertise invite people in and or send staff out in again, a kind of a staff exchange on a regional or kind of size basis? So again, that's something I'd be quite interested to see what people think of. And economic models, finally, are one of the things that were a real challenge. So we were aware that funding is one of the most challenging contexts that most institutions face today. And in that sense, digitisation is a real positive because the content is valuable. So should we be stimulating and encouraging new demand for that content? The content is engaging, it's insightful, it's a lot of it's undiscovered. So there are some real opportunities, frankly, to make money out of the content. But again, I was delighted to see Simon referencing this as well. The value is not always economic. And to the point I made earlier, we need to make sure that other values are also reflected in any digitisation strategies and policies that we have to ensure that there aren't whole areas of collections which are not being digitised, either because of their subject matter or because they're more obscure, or particularly with some of the more complex pieces of digital art or museum objects, for example, that they're too difficult to digitise. Or, again, possibly for a smaller institution, that they're simply too small. And one of the things, again, that came out in discussion with the task force was a real need to maintain awareness of some of the more informal archives, things like personal archives, community archives, and to ensure that whatever we recommended, that those policies worked for the smaller, more informal institutions, because their collections too are part of the cultural heritage content of the nation and are as important as the bigger institutions. We need to recognise the impact of limited funding as well. All of you will be aware that opportunities for securing funding for digitisation are limited and in many cases reducing. Even when they're not reducing, the competition is obviously growing, which effectively means it's reducing because the percentage of success in money funding schemes is very small. And that can be a real challenge for institutions of any size. So what do we need to do to unlock new funding and to maximise current opportunities? And again, to speak to the smaller institutions, do we need to find ways to support smaller cultural institutions or smaller community archives and collections who can't or struggle to secure funding from some of the major funding bodies? So secondly, we also need to create economic opportunities. So do we look to other sectors to identify and unlock economic opportunities, either by working in partnership with them or by trying to learn from some of the initiatives that they have instituted and implemented successfully themselves? And should we look at ways to move swiftly to capitalise on funding and investment opportunities which often come up very much at the last minute with very short deadlines? So is there a way that the sector can come together and perhaps create a kind of pool of semi-finished funding bids that can be worked out very quickly at the last moment so that we can put those in and really maximise our chances of getting funding? Would digitisation benefit from the application of shared services and centralised expertise? And finally, we need to accept that there is likely to be a mixed economy of funding. So it may be that some of it's commercially done, some of it then a patron may pay for a particular collection to be digitised. There may be some volunteer digitisation. The institution may be able to carve out some funding of its own to put forward to digitise. And that's fine, and it's likely to be the reality, but it means we need to be clear about that so that users coming to those digitised collections are aware exactly of what that picture is and that they know that it's not the full picture, and that if they need to access the full picture, they may need to move away to the analogue content. So from an ethical point of view, we really need to be open about what we're doing. So finally, to the sustainability issue, which has been called the thread that binds. So should we try and align with funding bodies, government initiatives or industry leaders? And how could we develop and nurture that kind of environment that meant that we were really in tune with funding bodies and with government so that we were working together instead of against? IP, as I said earlier, is a really big challenge in digitisation area. In the Culture of Digital project, there is another policy commitment being led by another institution, the partnership of institutions. So the Culture of Digitisation Task Force hasn't majored on IP, but we've inevitably had to touch on it. Particularly around considering what happens when, say, a project finishes. Someone talked earlier about content dropping off the edge of a cliff, and we've found that, and again there have been projects looking at the sustainability and even accessibility and existence of digitisation projects from the past, and a huge percentage of them have just disappeared and dropped off the back of the internet, and it's a waste of public money, but it also means that the content which should be available disappears. So we really need to think again about how we can maximise the sustainability and longevity of the collections that we have funded, whether that means recommending some kind of process via which, when projects finish, that the assets, the digital assets are dismantled, even if people can't afford to sustain them, whether they're parked somewhere for someone else with some future funding to come and rediscover and reuse. And finally, again, it was really interesting to see the Digital Repository of Ireland mentioned this morning, because in the discussions of the task force, on several occasions, people have talked about orphaned material collections that have been digitised in the past, but which the institution can no longer afford to maintain. And again, what happens to that kind of material? It's really important that it's kept for the cultural heritage of the nation. But if people are kind of passing collections around, do we need some kind of digital repository of last resort for material which would otherwise be lost? So again, that's something be interested to see what people think about that. So finally, infrastructure's come up a couple of times again too, and again, it's something that the task force has really identified as needing targeted investment, not only in digital infrastructure, in the hardware of digital infrastructure, but also in the skills and capability, rather than capital projects which come into being and end, whether there's some revenue funding which can also be provided to mean that collections are sustained. And once again, in that space, we do need a model that works for smaller as well as larger institutions. And as far as economic sustainability goes, we also need to have funding models which allow for different commercial approaches. So the whole piece around the sustainability theme is finding a way forward to future-proof both content and access to it. So next steps. Was obviously one of the next steps was coming to talk to you today, and we've got a workshop after this. So we really wanted to consult the sector to see what it is that the sector wants from a strategic review of digitisation. Are the themes that you've seen today ones that resonate with you? Are there things you radically disagree with? Are there things that you think have been omitted and that we've failed to notice so far? So I'd be really interested to hear and speak to people, perhaps in the workshop or afterwards, if they feel any burning comments that they'd like to pass on. One of the things that, again, that's come up hugely is the need to increase knowledge sharing and collaboration. There are some fantastic ideas, there are some fantastic resources and initiatives that are already underway. We'd really like to find some way, some portal for showcasing those. British Library, for example, has got a fantastic small-scale digitisation kit on their Endangered Archive site, which is a great resource for people to share. And the Collections Trust have done some fantastic work on definitions and standards. So one of the things the task force certainly wants to do is to make sure that those resources are pulled together into a place that everyone can identify and then use. And finally, we wanted to inspire, but we do need to keep one eye on what's achievable. So I will end on that note. I suspect, having looked at I've got a huge clock in front of me, which you can't see. I think I've probably run out of time, so I suspect we probably haven't got time for questions. But as I've said on the slide, we do have a workshop. So if you do want to come and input some ideas, please come to the workshop, or I'll be around for the rest of the day and after the conference. So if you'd like to take part in the group, in the surveys, in any comments or considerations to feed in to what we're going to be feeding into the broader report, please come and find me. In the meantime, thanks very much.